Welcome to the Brigham Young and Utah slavery video. All right, it actually talks about slavery in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 134, verse 12, we're going to start at. But it calls them bond servants. That's just another word for slave. You can see the definition above here. So starting in verse 12, we do not believe that it is right to interfere with bond servants or slaves, neither preach the gospel to them, nor baptize them, contrary to the will and wish of their masters. So don't interfere with them. We don't preach the gospel to them unless we have permission from their masters. We don't baptize them, etc. Okay, same source here, D&C 134, verse 12. We do not meddle with or influence the slaves in the least, to cause them to be dissatisfied with their situations in this life, thereby jeopardizing the lives of men. Don't meddle with them, don't influence them, don't take a position against slavery, basically. Don't cause them to be dissatisfied. Okay, same verse here, verse 12. Such interference we believe to be unlawful and unjust and dangerous to the peace of every government, allowing human beings to be held in servitude. Okay, we'll go over some preliminary statements by some different general authorities, etc. This one is from Bruce R. McConkie in Mormon Doctrine under the article Cursings, or the little section Cursings, 1958 edition. McConkie basically says that slavery was sent of God as a curse upon Israel. Slavery sent by God. So here's the whole statement. Slavery, poverty, war, and death are all sent of God as curses upon Israel for failure to keep the commandments. All right, even the geologist slash scientist James E. Talmage was racist. He's pictured above here. This is a statement in his diary, February 22nd, 1884 entry. Perhaps I am prejudiced, but to look at a Negro face selected almost at random, and then to claim that the black man is the equal of the white man in ability and mind, appears to me a miserable conclusion, contradicted by all appearances. The black man is not equal to the white man in ability and mind, or intelligence, I guess, according to James E. Talmage. This was before he was a general authority, however. All right, a new book put out by the church, well, at least in 2020, called Saints, No Unhallowed Hand. This is the second volume. I think there's going to be 4. They're becoming a little more honest. Still a lot of spin in these, though, as I've gone over in other videos, like in the inoculation video. But in this one it says, Brigham Young believed that black people were suited for servitude. So that's a fairly honest statement from a church source, right? Brigham Young believed that black people were suited for servitude. Okay, same source here, Saints, No Unhallowed Hand, page 182. There's going to be 2 more in the series. The next one I think is due out soon, Boldly, Nobly, and Independent. That's from 1894 to 1954. Then the next one is going to be Sounded in Every Ear, 1955 to 2010. All right, but in No Unhallowed Hand, it says the Utah Territory Legislature ultimately voted to create a system of black servitude in the territory. What is the system of black servitude? It's the legalization of slavery, which we'll go over on other slides. So you can see they're being very specific with their wording here. Okay, another church-approved source basically is the BYU Studies Journal. An article in there by Edward L. Kimball and a footnote says that black slavery was legal in Utah Territory until 1862. See, so the legalization of slavery in Utah is supported by Mormon sources and a lot of non-Mormon sources, or people who have left the church, as we're going to go over in other slides. All right, another preliminary statement here. This is about the prophet Gordon B. Hinckley. He actually apologized for the Mormon Church's role in slavery. The source for this is Joanna Brooks's book, Mormonism and White Supremacy, 2020. It came out. Pretty new book. In there it says that the prophet Gordon B. Hinckley apologized to a pastor, Cecil Murray, of the Los Angeles African Methodist Episcopal Church for the Mormon Church's role in slavery. Why did Gordon B. Hinckley make this apology, which is pretty rare for a Mormon general authority to do? It's probably in private to this pastor. Why did he do it? Because a founding member of Pastor Cecil Murray's church, who was named Biddy Mason, was a slave of a Mormon pioneer family in Utah. And so Hinckley apologized for that. Okay, another Mormon source from the progressive BYU professor Eugene England, 1973 statement. He's pictured above. It's painful to read Brigham Young supporting slavery of blacks and Indians. It's painful to read that. He predicted that the Civil War would not end slavery. He was wrong about that. And he repeated the racist myths of his time. It's painful to read this stuff. Okay, a racist poem by Eliza R. Snow. She was a plural wife of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. It's in her book, Poems, Religious, Historical, and Political, 1856. She says, slavery and anti-slavery, what a strife! Japheth shall dwell within the tents of Shem, and Ham shall be his servant. Who is Ham? Well, they are the African Americans in Mormon doctrine. Ham shall be his servant. Long ago the prophet said, I guess the prophet Joseph Smith, 'tis being now fulfilled. The curse of the Almighty rests upon the colored race. Okay, so some of the Book of Mormon prophets were actually against slavery. We have a statement here from the prophet and King Benjamin, Mosiah chapter 2. Neither have I suffered that ye should be confined in dungeons, nor that ye should make slaves of one another. You shouldn't do that. Nor that ye should murder or plunder or steal or commit adultery. So if the prophet King Benjamin is saying that we should not make slaves of one another, why is the prophet Brigham Young legalizing slavery in Utah? Okay, another prophet in the Book of Mormon said that there should not be any slaves either. This was the prophet and King Mosiah, Alma chapter 27. But Ammon said unto him, it is against the law of our brethren, which was established by my father, the prophet and King Mosiah. It was against the law of our brethren that there should be any slaves among them. That was against the law, but it was fine for Brigham Young. Okay, another interesting little tidbit from the Book of Abraham, another Mormon scripture. In there's 3 facsimiles. This one here is facsimile number 3. You can see that one of these persons or characters is black. So what did Joseph Smith have to say about this one black one? Figure number 6. His name was Olamlaw, and he was a slave belonging to the prince. So you can see Joseph Smith putting 2 and 2 together here. In his mind, slaves in the past were black, probably like they were in his present time. Okay, so the curse of Ham can be found in Genesis chapter 9 in the Bible. We'll read some verses out of there from the NIV Bible. Basically, because of what Ham did, he was cursed. and he was made the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. And Brigham Young and other Mormon apostles and prophets interpreted this passage that the descendants of Ham, basically black people, should be slaves or servants of servants. All right, so let's read this. Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 through 25, NIV. When Noah drank some wine, he became drunk, and he lay uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. So he's black. He's the father of Canaan. So he saw his father naked and told his two brothers outside. But I guess he's kind of maybe mocking him, didn't cover him up. But then Shem and Japheth took a garment and laid it across their shoulders. Then they walked in backwards and covered their father's naked body. I guess that's what they were supposed to do, and what Ham did, what he was not supposed to do. When Noah awoke from his wine, he said, "Cursed be Canaan," black people. "The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." All right, so slavery is condoned all through the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, and Jesus never said anything against slavery. You think he could have said one thing, Jesus could say one thing to set the record straight due to all the problems we would have later with the Civil War and everything, but no, Jesus never said one single thing about slavery. We'll give one example here, another example here from the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 25. This is the NIV again, which is a more accurate translation than the KJV. Do research on that on your own. Okay, so Leviticus 25. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. From the nations around you, you can buy them. You may also buy some of the temporary residents that are living among you and members of their clans born in your country. You can buy them, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, so they basically never get out of it, and you can make them slaves for life. All right, just one example of slavery in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 18, NIV. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourself to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Submit yourself to harsh masters. This is in the New Testament, folks. This is Christianity. All right, so here is a lie, some apologetics by a BYU professor named Andrew C. Skinner. We're not going to go too much into the apologetics. I'm sure I could find a ton more lies, spins from different Mormons. This statement comes from the Encyclopedia of Latter-day Saint History, Deseret Book 2000. Skinner says that church leaders from Joseph Smith on have spoken against slavery. That's all he says, right? He doesn't say that they ever spoke for slavery. Well, that's why this is a lie, because Joseph Smith was very mixed in his remarks. Brigham Young was very mixed in his remarks about slavery. In this video, we're going to go over a lot of the controversial things that Brigham Young and a few other general authority contemporaries of Brigham Young. We're going to go over the controversial stuff. We're not going to go over all the positive stuff they said about slavery. Okay, here's another whopper. Member of the 70, Alexander B. Morrison, article in the Ensign in 2000. How grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has from its beginnings stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations. This is just a blatant lie. You could probably tell this is a lie from the slides that we've already gone over. We're going to go through a lot more. Joseph Smith and Brigham Young did not stand strongly against racism. They were mixed at best. And we're going to show a lot of the really bad things that Brigham Young said. All right, we're going to get into the main part of the video now. Brigham Young and Utah slavery. First source here is from Dennis Lithgow, Negro Slavery in Utah. It was in the Utah Historical Quarterly Journal, 1971. On the Brigham Young Monument, see the picture on the left here, at the intersection of Main and South Temple Streets in Salt Lake City, we find these names, and see the plaque on the right here, Green Flake, Hark Lay, and Oscar Crosby, colored servants. This is on a plaque in downtown Salt Lake City. These three people were colored servants, aka slaves. And we're going to go over more evidence for that on the next few slides. All right, some more information about this from John Z. Brown in his autobiography. 1941, I guess it was published. It says in there, I, Amasa M. Lyman Jr., knew all three of those Negro servants, Green, Hark, and Oscar, who were on that plaque. I knew all of these Negro servants who were members of President Brigham Young's Pioneer Company of 1847. That's something you don't hear in Sunday school, right? Brigham Young coming into the Salt Lake Valley in his Pioneer Company in 1847. His wagon wagon driver, which we'll go over on the next few slides, was a black slave, probably, and there was two other slaves in his company. You're never going to hear this in Sunday school. All right, so you always hear about Brigham Young coming into the Salt Lake Valley and saying, this is the place. You always hear about that in church manuals, etc. What you don't hear is that the driver of his wagon was a slave, Green Flake. The source on this one is William E. Parrish, The Mississippi Saints, the Historian Journal, 1988. He says, one significant piece of Flake family lore places Green Flake as the driver of Brigham Young's personal wagon. Thus, when Brigham Young spoke his famous words upon seeing the Salt Lake Valley, it is enough, this is the right place, move on, driver, he may have been speaking to a black slave. That's something you don't hear in Sunday school, right? All right, a more direct statement about this. It's from Richard Van Wagner and Stephen C. Walker in their book, A Book of Mormons, 1982. They say one of the three black servants in the Pioneer Company, that's Brigham Young's Pioneer Company, one of these was Green Flake. See the picture above, big tall guy it looks like. Green Flake drove James Flake's white-topped carriage that was used by Brigham Young during the trek and entrance into the Salt Lake Valley. By Green's own account, he was in the first wagon through the Immigration Canyon. All right, so we're going to be going in chronological order as we usually do in these videos. We're going to start out here in 1845. Statement from the Apostle Orson Hyde in a speech delivered before the High Priest Quorum in Nauvoo, Illinois. Orson's pictured above here. He says, Ham, the son of Noah, saw the nakedness of his father while he lay drunk in his tent. We read that scripture. And he with wicked joy ran like Rigdon. He's probably talking about Sidney Rigdon, who went in and out of the church, I believe, and made the wonderful disclosure to his brethren, Noah's in there naked and drunk on wine. This brought the curse of slavery upon him. Servant of servants, right? So not only the curse of not having the priesthood, but Orson Hyde here, who is an apostle, says it brought the curse of slavery upon him. Okay, so the prophet Brigham Young used the N-word. I'm not going to pronounce the whole thing here. I could get kicked off of YouTube or something like that. This is in the Journal History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, May 29, 1847. Also see the Desert News article listed here. During the 1847 Pioneer Exodus, Brigham Young chastised the Vanguard Company for their apparently irreverent merrymaking. And he says, I have let the brethren dance and fiddle and act the N-word. They will stoop to dance like N-word. I don't mean this as debasing the N-word by any means. So he used this word. Other general authorities use this too. We have one slide from John Taylor, and there's others. All right, another statement from the prophet Brigham Young in 1848 called the Indians the devil and said they are not equal to the whites. Brigham Young says, treat them as Indians and not as your equals. Not as your equals. Tie up your animals so that the devil or the Indians cannot get them. All right, so there's a lot of details and context about Utah slavery that I'm not going to go into. A really good source if you want to get more context is John G. Turner's book, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet, 2012. Read everything in there about slavery, Utah slavery and Brigham Young. Really good, and I'll give you one other source too in a minute here. But around 1849, Southern state Mormons had brought somewhere between 50 and 100 black slaves into Deseret, which was the precursor to the Utah Territory. So somewhere between 50 and 100. Kind of hard to count them all. All right, so here's the other source that I highly recommend. Getting a lot more details, a lot more context. All the pro things that Joseph said about slavery, all the negative things he said about it, all the pro things that Brigham said, all the negative. I'm just focusing on the controversial stuff here in this video, and there's a lot. Like using the N-word, you know. Sometimes that's all you need to know. Just some of the controversial stuff. Oh, Brigham Young used the N-word? That doesn't sound like language that would be used by a prophet. Anyway, so this source, probably the biggest expert on this subject is Newell G. Bringhurst. He's done the most journal articles. He's done the most books about it. And this is a really good one. Saints, Slaves, and Blacks, The Changing Place of Black People Within Mormonism. You get the second enlarged edition, which came out in 2018, and you can see the cover here. Okay, another interesting statement from Lithgow in his article, Negro Slavery in Utah. Utah was the only Western territory in 1850 in which Negroes were held as slaves. Interesting. All the other Western territories in 1850 did not legalize slavery, but Brigham Young did. All right, back to Turner's book. Senator William Henry Seward of New York, see picture above, noted the presence of slaves among the Mormons during an early July 1850 speech. So they were there. All right, another statement from the apostle and president of the 12, Orson Hyde. Next in line to be the prophet, maybe? President of the 12, 1851. He says, there are several men in the valley of the Salt Lake from the southern states who have slaves with them. There is no law in Utah to authorize slavery, neither any to prohibit it. But later on, Brigham Young would make a law to authorize slavery. Okay, some interesting information from Lester E. Bush, Jr., a Mormon writer, in Dialogue, came out in 2001. Fairly important article on the subject, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine and a Historical Overview. In there it says that Brigham Young had the following book in his office library. It was entitled Negro Mania, being an examination of the falsely assumed equality of the various races of men, by John Campbell, came out in 1851. So a very racist book in Brigham Young's library. All right, so you may have heard about this on social media, that Green Flake was actually given to Brigham Young as a tithing payment. Source on this, Church Historian's Office Journal, Church History Library, March 26, 1851. According to the recollection of Agnes Flake's son, Brigham Young accepted Green Flake's service to the church as a tithing payment from his owner. Green Flake worked for Brigham Young for about a year or two, apparently as his slave, or at the very least a servant. All right, source here from William J. Flake in a letter to the church historian, February 14, 1894, LDS Church Historians Library. Miss Flake gave her Negro slave Green Flake to the church as tithing. He then worked for 2 years for President Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, and then got his liberty and settled near Union, Utah. So here's another source to support that. There was a movie put out about Green Flake, from Southern slave to Western, from Southern slave to Western hero. This is a very propagandistic film. It's basically church propaganda. You can buy this DVD at Deseret Book. They don't put anything in Deseret Book that is not faith promoting. There's very little controversial stuff in there, and it just watches like any other church film that you'll watch. It's propaganda. So I got the DVD and watched this in preparation for this video. It's not streaming anywhere online. You have to buy the DVD, but I would not recommend it anyway. Okay, another article by Jack Beller, Negro Slaves in Utah, Utah Historical Quarterly, 1929. This is the first time I've ever really used that much information from the Utah Historical Quarterly, but that is the perfect journal for Utah slavery, obviously. This article came out in 1929. The apostle and in the first presidency, Heber C. Kimball had a slave named Martha, who later married Green Flake. Very interesting, right? So Heber C. Kimball had a slave too. All right, same source here from Beller. The apostle Charles C. Rich, pictured above, owned 6 slaves. So that's pretty interesting. One of the apostles of the church, called to be a special witness of Christ, a prophet, seer, and revelator, had 6 slaves. Charles C. Rich. All right, Leonard J. Arrington mentions this too, about Charles C. Rich's slaves. In his book, Charles C. Rich, Mormon General and Western Frontiersman, 1974. He uses a little bit softer language, of course, because he's a Mormon and doesn't want to get in trouble. All right, so Arrington says, sharing the discomforts with the Apostle Charles C. Rich party may have been 3 pairs of Negro slaves who perhaps had made the entire trip from Nauvoo. May have been. Well, I think there's enough evidence in other sources to show that he did have 6 slaves. And here's where Arrington confirms it. According to Charles' grandson, Benjamin L. Rich, Charles owned the slaves. 3 pairs, which is 6 slaves. All right, the Mormon writer Lester E. Bush also confirms that the Apostle Charles C. Rich was a slaveholder in his article, Mormonism's Negro Doctrine, 2001. So he says Apostle Charles C. Rich was one of at least 8 slaveholders to be sent on the mission to San Bernardino, California. So some of the Mormons went over to California. Slavery was illegal there. So I believe when the slaves got there, they became free. And if you look at the history of Utah slaves, once they had the opportunity to be free, almost all of them chose to be free. All right, Brigham Young had another black servant named Isaac James. He was his coachman, the driver of his wagon, like a Green Flake. Not sure if he was just a servant or a slave. Sometimes it's hard to really differentiate because they do basically the same things. This is, again, from Turner's book, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet. All right, so there was also Indian slaves, and Indian slavery also became legal when Brigham Young made it legal, which we'll get to. This is from the History of Brigham Young, a manuscript in the archives of the LDS Church Historian's Office, 1851. You can see where Iron County is on the map here above. I, Brigham Young, spoke upon the importance of the Iron County mission. You can see that's in southern Utah. I advised them to buy up the Lamanite children as fast as they could. Buy them up. Well, they were slaves. It could be argued that it was better to buy them up and they had a better quality of life, but definitely not easy, right? Being taken from their families, being indoctrinated into a different culture. I advise them to buy them up and educate them and teach them the gospel so that many generations would not pass ere they should become a white and delightsome people. So there's more racism, right? All right, another statement from Brigham Young. This one can be found in Wilford Woodruff's journal, 1851. I have two blacks, Brigham Young commented in 1851. They are as free as I am. Basically two black slaves, I guess. Were they really as free as Brigham Young was? No. All right, so who were these two blacks that Brigham Young had? Last names James and Flake. We've talked about them. They were not as free as Brigham because they could not vote in Utah. They did not possess most other basic citizenship rights, and they could not marry. According to the teachings of the territory's quasi-established church, the Mormon Church. You can find this in Turner's book. Okay, another statement from Brigham Young, General Church Minutes, July 6, 1851. Brigham Young maintained that to abolish slavery, it would be throat cutting to the whites and damnation to the blacks. Cut your own throats if we abolish slavery. So I guess he's for slavery in this statement, right? And it would be damnation to the blacks to not be slaves. Interesting that he uses a throat cutting metaphor, I guess, but that used to be part of the Mormon temple endowment ceremony. We agree that our throats be cut from ear to ear and our tongues torn out by the roots. Pre-1930. And in Bagley's book, it talks about the Latter-day Saints purchasing Native American children. And, of course, they made the arguments that it was for their own good. So Isaac Morley testified that Latter-day Saints purchased Native children. This is basically slavery, indentured servitude. Purchased Native children to save them from misery, starvation, cruelty, and death, which was echoed by Brigham Young, who claimed that citizens bought the Indians to obtain their liberty and to save them from starvation, abuse, and even death. Conflict in terms there, right? Citizens or Mormons bought the Indians to obtain their liberty. So now that they're indentured servants, now they have liberty and freedom. That sounds like something Orwell would say, right? Okay, another source about Utah slavery comes from John W. Gunnison in his book, The Mormons or the Latter-day Saints in the Great Salt Lake, 1852. He says, involuntary labor by the Negroes is recognized by custom in the Utah Territory. Those holding slaves keep them as part of their family, as they would their wives, without any law on the subject, which would come, though, soon. Negro caste springs naturally from their doctrine of blacks being ineligible to the priesthood. So, in actual practice here, they had slaves before it was legalized, and they obviously had slaves after it was legalized. Okay, another statement from John W. Gunnison, pictured above. The Mormons hold the Negro is cursed as to the priesthood, and must always be a servant wherever his lot is cast. He's getting that from Brigham Young and others. And therefore shall never attain to anything above a dim, shining glory. This part of the human race, the black people, is the lowest grade. Okay, a speech by Brigham Young, which shows up in the Deseret News, January 10th, 1852 now. Brigham Young called for a middle ground between making African Americans beasts of the field and elevating them to full equality with their superiors. Some kind of middle ground. At least they're not like a cow in the field, right? Okay, same speech here in the Deseret News. Brigham Young envisioned black people as the servants of benevolent white patriarchs, not slaves to cruel owners. So he still believes in slavery, basically, but he doesn't believe in being cruel to them. Okay, from the same speech, Brigham Young said that blacks were naturally designed for servitude. Naturally designed for servitude. Okay, same speech. Brigham Young counseled the legislators. So here's where they're getting into making slavery legal in the legislature. He counseled them that it was inappropriate to elevate the blacks, as some seemed disposed to an equality with those whom nature and nature's God has indicated to be their masters, their superiors. They're not equal. Nature and nature's God has indicated that the whites should be the masters of the blacks. The whites, who are the superior ones, should be their masters. Okay, so here's an admission from the church, from the Race and the Priesthood essay, Gospel Topics essay on the church's website, churchofjesuschrist.org. It's in a footnote 10 in this essay. They use a little bit of weaselly language, but they basically admit that Brigham Young legalized slavery. They say the Utah Territorial Legislature legalized black servitude, quote unquote. They like using the word servitude because it's a little softer, right, than slavery, but it's basically slavery what they're saying here. Brigham Young and the legislatures perceived servitude, quote unquote, to be a more humane alternative to slavery. It's basically slavery, though. All of the historians on this topic say that it was slavery, except maybe some of the BYU apologists. Maybe they would say, well, we can't jump from servitude to slavery. But here is basically the admission from the church. Okay, so Brigham Young is a lot more direct than the church essays, of course. This statement comes from a speech given in the joint session of the legislature. So here we are almost to the point where he's going to legalize it. You can also find this in Turner's book. In 1852, Brigham Young said, "I am a firm believer in slavery." There it is, and I'm going to legalize it. He's going to. And inasmuch as I believe in the Bible, inasmuch as I believe in the ordinances of God, in the priesthood and order and decrees of God, I must believe in slavery. Okay, same speech here, January 23rd, 1852, joint session of the legislature in the Utah Territory. Brigham Young suggested that a well-treated slave is much better off than if he was free. Well, ask the slave. If you ask them, almost 100% will say, I would rather be free. Okay, another statement from Turner, Brigham Young Pioneer Prophet Book, 2012. Like many pro-slavery apologists, Brigham Young suggested that the institution of slavery was a positive good, both for the slaves and their owners. Okay, Turner continues. Cursed as slaves and excluded from the priesthood, Americans of African descent had few political rights in the kingdom of God. They had few political rights. in the Utah Territory. Okay, Turner continues. Brigham Young allowed that slaves were citizens, but they could not vote or hold offices. Brigham Young did not believe in blacks being over whites. All right, again, Brigham Young is going to say that he believes in slavery, but he doesn't believe in abusing the slaves. So that makes him a better slave owner, right? Wilford Woodruff Journal, around 1852. I, Brigham Young, am opposed to the present system of plantation slavery. The Negro should serve the seed of Abraham, all the white people, but it should be done right. Don't abuse the Negro and treat him cruel, but we should still have slavery, and Abraham's pictured above. So Brigham Young was not against slavery, either for blacks or for Indians. The Mormon legislature passed laws regulating slavery. Utah was the only part of the Mexican cession open to black slavery. Brigham Young was open to the idea of black slavery and by extension, Indian slavery. As governor, Brigham Young believed that the Bible justified slavery and polygamy, and so enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. All right, so how can we know for sure that Brigham Young legalized slavery? Well, look at the documents. Senate miscellaneous documents, House miscellaneous documents. That slavery was legally recognized institution in the Utah Territory is established by the presence on the statute books of a slave code enacted by the legislature in 1852 and by provisions in the draft constitutions of 1856, 1860, and 1862, which restrict certain political rights to free white male citizens. Statute books of a slave code and in the draft constitutions for 3 years. So it's beyond dispute that this happened. All right, a little statement here from Wallace Turner in his book, The Mormon Establishment, 1966. Until the federal government outlawed slavery, the Mormons bought and sold Negroes in Salt Lake City. Okay, another speech from Brigham Young, January 23rd, 1852. This one's a little more obscure, and most people probably don't know about it. It's talked about in the Leonard J. Arrington papers, the Brigham Young collection, sermons and writings of the Restoration by Ogden Kraut, and the teachings of the President Brigham Young by Fred Collier, who would sneak into LDS archives and sneak out with I guess with microfiche. I think with microfiche. But in this speech, Brigham Young says, people contend about slavery to know what it is. We know that it exists, and such a thing shall and will exist until the Lord God shall remove it. Until then, it will and ought to exist, slavery. He's wrong about this because the Lord God did not remove it. The Civil War and President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation removed it. And Brigham Young said that those things would not happen. Okay, same sources here. Ogden Kraut is pictured above. He's a Mormon fundamentalist who practiced polygamy and wrote a lot of books on church history and doctrine and stuff. Same speech here, January 23rd, 1852. Brigham Young says, I know that slavery is right, and there should be a law made to have the slaves serve their masters. There should be a law for slavery, because they are not capable of ruling themselves. Okay, same sources here, same speech, January 23rd, 1852. Pretty obscure speech here. I am firm in the belief that they, the Africans, ought to dwell in servitude. When a master has a Negro and uses him well, he, the Negro, is much better off than if he was free. That's not what the Negroes say, though. All right, another speech, the joint session of legislature, February 5th, 1852. He gave a number of speeches to the legislature. Brigham Young says, "It is a great blessing to the seed of Adam to have the seed of Cain for servants." All right, so what about the fugitive slave law? Runaway slaves. Well, Brigham Young says that we should go after them and bring them back to their masters, right? This is what he told a territorial marshal, Horace Eldridge, pictured above. Go after him and bring them back, right? They're your property. So this can be found in the Brigham Young letter to Horace S. Eldridge, July 12, 1852, in the Brigham Young Papers. In July of 1852, Brigham Young forwarded an advertisement for a runaway Negro to the territorial marshal and church member Horace Eldridge, pointedly reminding him that if he should encounter the escaped slave, the fugitive slave law will no doubt be honored. This act required that slaves be returned to their owners, even if they were in a free state. Wow, so they could be in California and be free, and Brigham Young would say, no, bring them back to Utah, bring them back to their rightful owner. And again, I think I mentioned this, but Horace Eldridge pictured above. Okay, so John G. Turner confirms this as well in his book. Brigham Young also upheld enforcement of the 1850 fugitive slave law, returning runaway blacks to their owners on at least 2 occasions during the 1850s. So according to Turner, we have 2 examples of Brigham Young doing this. Okay, same source here, Turner's book. Utah's slavery legislation also criminalized interracial sexual relations. So not only was Brigham Young against interracial relationships, he criminalized it. He made it illegal. Okay, Turner continues here. Utah law prescribed a $500 to $1,000 fine and a prison term of up to 3 years for any white person engaging in sexual intercourse with any of the African race. Big fine and a prison term for sexual intercourse between a white and a black. In today's money, 2022, this would be between $18,000 and $37,000. So a huge fine. All right, another depressing letter here from Andrew Seiler to Brigham Young in 1853. Mormons killed 5 male Indians for stealing. Afterwards, their property, their wives, and their children was brought into the ring. Basically confiscated, I guess. Their property, their wives, and their children. The property and the children were sold to the highest bidder. That's pretty depressing. President Isaac Morley, who's pictured above, bid 3 bushels of wheat for a girl that was 8 or 9 years old, but she was run up to 16 bushels and knocked off to William V. Black, Jr. So William V. Black bought a girl 8 or 9 years old for 16 bushels of wheat. That was the value of an Indian girl. All right, some information about these Weber County Indians taking their weapons and basically turning them into indentured servants. Brown, Bill Hickman, Elisha Ryan, and Dimmick Huntington delivered an order to Major Moore and the citizens of Weber County to disarm Chief Little Soldier and his band of Indians and distribute them among the Mormons. Disarm them, take them, and distribute these Indians among the Mormons who are best able to feed and clothe them for the winter, and set them to work. Take their arms, bring them into the Mormon communities, and put them to work. Well, this was basically indentured servitude or slavery. Now, was it better than starving in the mountains? Maybe. In the winter, not able to obtain food? Maybe. Okay, a statement here from a BYU thesis from Nathaniel R. Ricks, 2007. He says, Indian slaves purchased by the Mormons were essentially indentured to the Mormon family until they reached maturity. So for their, well, I guess until they're an adult, right? So a good portion of their life. But this was slavery. It could be argued that it was better for these Indians. You could probably make an argument that it was worse. All right, from George W. Bean's diary and autobiography. Chief Walker forced them, the Mormons, to take 8 little Indians or slaves rather than have them butchered by the cruel Utes. So this is a complicated situation, I guess, and you know, it needs further context. You could probably make an entire video about this and give more context about these poor little kids. I mean, in really dire circumstances, and sometimes they'd be killed by their own peoples or by other Indian tribes. So, and then Chief Walker forced the Mormons to take 8 little Indian slaves rather than have them butchered by the Utes. So, sad situation. All right, the account continues. This can be found in Bagley's book, The Whites Want Everything. The Shoshones were so hostile that we had to make a show of arms before they would submit to our proposition of distributing them among the whites. The Mormons disarmed them. So they're hostile. The Mormons make a show of arms. Indians then submit to coming into the Mormon settlements and being distributed among the whites or the Mormons to now be workers. Okay, an interview with Apostle John Taylor and N.H. Felt in the Millennial Star, 1855. John Taylor went on to become the prophet. So in this interview, it has the following. As respects slavery in the Utah Territory, we were assured that there was but little of it there, yet it is there. Slavery is in the Utah Territory. How many slaves are now held there, they could not say, but the number relatively was by no means small. So I'm not sure what he means by no means small, because slavery was never huge in Utah, but you know there were slaves. All right, a little tangent here, just to show how ruthless the Indians could be to their own slaves. This comes from Richard Van Wagner and Stephen Walker's book, again, A Book of Mormons. In 1855, the Utah Shoshone Indian chief Wakara died. Most accounts of the burial agree that a slave boy was sealed alive in the tomb of aspen logs and boulders with instructions to watch Wakara. Man! Slave boy buried alive in the tomb and couldn't get out. Okay, same source here. 3 days later, a group of Wakara's braves, I guess the females, inspected the area. They ignored pleas of a thirst-crazed boy, a boy. They ignored him, who complained that Wakara was beginning to stink. This was ruthless, you know. The Indian slaves were just treated so poorly by both Indians and by Mormons. All right, some more views of slavery from Brigham Young, his views. Journal of Discourses, 1855. The seed of Ham, which is the seed of Cain, descending through Ham, will, according to the curse put upon him, serve his brethren. That's basically black people, will serve his brethren and be a servant of servants to his fellow creatures until God removes the curse. These are my views upon slavery. So the black people will serve the white people. Okay, Brigham Young continues in the same speech. February 18, 1855. The blacks should be used like servants and not like brutes, but they must serve. They are not entitled to the priesthood. The blacks should be used like servants. All right, a statement from Brigham Young again in the New York Herald, May 4th, 1855. You can find this in Stanley P. Hershon's book, The Lion of the Lord, 1969. Brigham Young said, "You must not think from what I say that I am opposed to slavery." He's not opposed to slavery. "No, the Negro is damned and is to serve his master until God chooses to remove the curse of Ham. These are my views, and consequently the views of all the saints on abolitionism." Okay, a statement from one of Brigham Young's contemporaries, the Apostle George A. Smith, Journal of Discourses, 1855, basically saying the curse of servitude for the African Americans is irrevocable. He says, "Philanthropists who were ignorant of the irrevocable decrees of the Almighty God have exerted themselves vigorously to thwart the purposes of the Almighty in trying to remove the curse of servitude from the descendants of Canaan," which are African Americans, trying to remove the curse, but their endeavors are vain and useless, because this decree from God is irrevocable. Okay, Apostle George A. Smith continues, "When God has decreed a certain way for men to be in servitude, and has designed that they shall hold that position of servants, it is worse than useless for any man or set of men to undertake to put them in a position to rule." Black people cannot rule over white people. Okay, another statement from the Apostle George A. Smith. This comes from D. Michael Quinn's book, Extensions of Power. On March 21st, 1856, the Apostle George A. Smith seconded a motion to add the following to the proposed Constitution. "We recognize the right of the people of this state, Utah Territory, to adopt and regulate African slavery as they in their wisdom may deem proper." Okay, Quinn continues, pictured above in his younger days. "Delegates who voted to authorize African slavery in the proposed state of Deseret included First Presidency Counselor Jedediah M. Grant." These are the ones who voted to authorize slavery. Also the Apostles George A. Smith, Ezra T. Benson, and Lorenzo Snow, who went on to become the prophet. Okay, so here's kind of an example of Brigham Young contradicting himself. General Church Minutes, 1856. Brigham Young said that it is a curse to any community to have the slaves in it. But he legalized slavery in Utah, so go figure. "Keep the blacks out and let the white men do the work, and the people will rise." Keep the blacks out, let the whites do the work. Okay, same source here. Regardless of constitutions and laws, Brigham Young argued that persons of African descent would be in perpetual slavery. Perpetual slavery. And he says the Civil War would not free them, but... All right, slaves were pretty valuable in the Utah Territory and in other territories, states. Here is a African servant girl that was consecrated and deeded to the church. And we have record of this in John Z. Brown's book, Autobiography of Pioneer John Brown, 1820 to 1896. Came out in 1941 or published in 1941. On the 8th of January, 1857, I, John Brown, consecrated and deeded to the church the following: an African servant girl who was named Betsy Brown Fluellen. Consecrated and deeded her, the girl, to the church for $1,000. In today's money, this would be about $32,000. Okay, there was another Mormon named William Taylor Dennis who also consecrated a slave girl to the church. This can be found in Tanya Reeder's article, Red Slave Histories in the Utah Historical Quarterly, 2017. Dennis is pictured above. So Dennis consecrated a slave girl to the trustee and trust of the church. All right, the Apostle John Taylor, in a speech again, went on to become the prophet. This was a speech in 1857. He's talking about the abolitionist Horace Greeley. Taylor says, this Horace Greeley is one of their popular characters in the East, and one that supports the stealing of N-word, the stealing of the N-word, and the Underground Railroad. So here we have John Taylor using the N-word too, and other general authorities did as well. I'm not going to go over all of them. All right, an article in the Atlantic Monthly, 1859, says that in 1858, Utah had several hundred Indians held in servitude. So Utah Mormons held several hundred Indians in servitude, indentured servants, or basically slaves, to work around the house, take care of the house, engage in farming, and growing their food, etc. Okay, this Horace Greeley interviewed Brigham Young. Greeley was the influential publisher and editor of the New York Tribune, and this interview shows up in his book, Overland Journey from New York to San Francisco. So Horace Greeley asked the question, what is the position of your church with respect to slavery? And he's asking Brigham Young. Brigham Young says, we consider it of divine institution, and not to be abolished until the curse pronounced on Ham shall have been removed from his descendants. So it wasn't the Civil War that was going to end it. The curse pronounced on Ham would have to be removed, which it never really was. I mean, when Spencer W. Kimball gave them the priesthood, they never really talked about removing any type of a curse. That would be too controversial in 1978. But here we got Horace Greeley. He's pictured above here, asking the question, and Brigham Young directly saying, slavery is a divine institution. Okay, so the interview continues. Horace Greeley asks, are any slaves now held in the Utah Territory? Brigham Young says there are. Greeley asks, do your territorial laws uphold slavery? Brigham Young says, if slaves are brought here by those who owned them in the states, we do not favor their escape from the service of their owners. And by this time, slavery has been legalized, and Brigham Young does not favor the escape of slaves from the service of their owners. And he says there are slaves in the territory. Pictured above, a later edition of Greeley's book, An Overland Journey. Okay, another speech from Brigham Young, October 9, 1859, in the Journal of Discourses. The Lord put a mark upon Cain, which is the flat nose and the black skin, and after the flood another curse is pronounced upon the same race, that they should be the servant of servants, and they will be until that curse is removed, and the abolitionists cannot help it, nor in the least alter that decree. Well, the Civil War took care of that, right? Okay, back to Quinn's book, Extensions of Power. He talks about a record of the sale of a Negro boy for $800. On September 7, 1859, a Salt Lake City clerk records the sale of a 26-year-old Negro boy for $800 to William H. Hooper, elected a month before as Utah's delegate to Congress. So a man of some standing in the Utah Territory, William H. Hooper, pictured above, bought this Negro boy for $800. Okay, an article by Joanna Brooks in Dialogue, The Possessive Investment in Rightness, White Supremacy and the Mormon Movement, came out in 2018, and then she did her book, what's it called, Mormon White Supremacy or something like that, which we talked about a little bit. So she talks about this guy named Abraham O. Smoot. He's pictured above. He was a stake president in the church and mayor of Salt Lake City. So again, another man of some standing in the community. Smoot owned and hired 3 slaves. The 1851 census slave schedule shows that Abraham and Margaret Smoot were in possession of a slave named Lucy. The Great Salt Lake County 1860 census schedule of slave inhabitants shows A.O. Smoot as being in possession of 2 male slaves. Both were age 40, one of whom, who was named Jerry, may have been procured for him by Brigham Young. So that's kind of interesting, right? Brigham Young procuring slaves for Abraham O. Smoot here. Okay, same dialogue article here by Joanna Brooks. This came out in 2018. She's now talking about a letter from Brigham Young in 1860 to a dear Sister Lewis, and he gives her advice about what to do with her slave. So Brigham Young says, I understand that you are frequently importuned to sell your Negro man, Jerry. Frequently importuned. So this shows that a lot of people in the Utah Territory were interested in buying slaves. So there was somewhat of a market here for slaves, and a lot of interest in this guy named Jerry. Brigham Young says, I should certainly deem it most advisable for you to keep him, but should you at any time conclude otherwise and determine to sell him, ordinary kindness would require that you should sell him to some kind of a faithful member of the church. So giving advice here. I, Brigham Young, have been told that he is about 40 years old. If so, it is not presumable, excuse me, if so, it is not presumable that you will, in the case of a sale, ask so high a price as you might expect for a younger person. So this 40-year-old slave, Jerry, Brigham Young giving advice to this Sister Lewis about what kind of price she should ask. Is this really the job of a prophet? You should try to get this much for your slave, or you should try to get this much. If the price is sufficiently moderate, I may conclude to purchase him and set him at liberty. Brigham Young thinks about buying this slave, I guess. Your brother in the gospel, Brigham Young, January 3rd, 1860. So Brooks got this information from a lady named Amy Tanner Theriot, who's actually writing a book about Utah slavery right now. She is a Mormon lady. I think the book is going to be partly honest and partly apologetic, but we'll see when it comes out. I'll probably get it. But Brooks had a personal correspondence with this Theriot lady, who's been doing a lot of this research. Personal correspondence, November 10th, 2017. Brigham Young never purchased Jerry. Instead, by June 1st of 1860, he was in the possession of Abraham Smoot, who we talked about. Okay, 3rd District Court in Salt Lake County recorded 3 individuals among the property of the deceased Abraham O. Smoot. Here's the record here. You can't really read it very well. Maybe you can zoom in on it somehow. So 3 slaves basically to Abraham O. Smoot. One colored man who was 35 years old. He was worth $700, which is a lot of money back then. One woman 16 years old, $500, so very young. And one girl 11 years old, $300, well, even younger. So these are the 3 slaves or property of Abraham O. Smoot, a man of some standing in the community. All right, statement from Brigham Young in his office journal, 1860. He says, Mr. Ruth inquired if it was difficult to rear Indian children. The president, Brigham Young, said that it was. I have an Indian woman who assists me in the housekeeping and is an excellent hand at that work. I obtained her when she was a child. So maybe bought her. Maybe she became an indentured servant. Okay, a statement from Brigham Young that shows up in the diary of Charles Lowell Walker, December 30, 1860 entry. Brigham Young touched on slavery and said that it always was so and always would be. Slavery always was so and always would be. Well, that ended in the Civil War, so he was wrong about that. The inferior would always be in subjection to the superior. The blacks through Cain and Ham would be servants of servants until every son and daughter had received their blessings. Well, the gospel has not gone to all the white people, even in 2022. Giving of the blacks the priesthood in 1978 contradicts the statement here by Brigham Young. And he says the slavery always was so and always would be. Well, the Civil War ended that, right? And Charles Lowell Walker is pictured above. Okay, back to Turner's book. He's pictured above. Professor at George Mason University, I believe. This book was published by Harvard Press, Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet. In 1862, Brigham Young still contended that there was nothing peculiar about African slavery. It was a divinely ordained institution, and we've talked about this. Okay, statement from Brigham Young in the Journal of Discourses, May 31st, 1863 now. Still going in chronological order here. In the providences of God, the ability of the African Americans is such that they cannot rise above the position of a servant. Well, they have now in the modern society, right? So Brigham Young is wrong. They cannot rise above the position of a servant, and they are willing to serve me and have me dictate their labor. Slaveholder. Brigham Young, the slaveholder, right? They should be willing to serve me, prophet, priest, and king of the Utah theocracy, and have me dictate their labor. All right, same source here. May 31st, 1863 speech. Maybe God will give to Brigham Young the power to own 100 slaves, he says. But you got to treat them right. If he, God, has given me power to rule this people in the Utah territory, to rule them, he thinks of himself as like a king, or to own 100 slaves, he requires at my hands how I use this influence and power over his creatures, and he will punish me if I abuse it. But having 100 slaves, that's okay, as long as he's nice to them, right? Okay, another speech by Brigham Young, October 6, 1863, Journal of Discourses. The American Civil War is going on at this time. Brigham Young says, Ham will continue to be the servant of servants as the Lord has decreed until the curse is removed. Will the present struggle of the American Civil War free the slave? No. False prophecy here. Can you destroy the decrees of the Almighty? You cannot. All right, another Brigham Young speech mentioned by C.V. Waite in the book The Mormon Prophet and His Harem, 1866. Governor Harding is a N worshiper. I'm not going to say the words. An N worshiper. A black-hearted abolitionist is what he is and what he represents, and that I do naturally despise. Brigham Young despises the abolitionists. All right, so we're almost done here with this video. We'll talk a little bit about the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the African Americans. This statement shows up in Roldo v. Dutson's BYU thesis from 1964. With the conclusion of the Civil War, which ended on April 9th, 1865, came the emancipation of the Negro. Likewise, the Negroes in Utah were given their freedom too. Many left the families to whom they had been in bondage. They wanted to be free, while others remained living out their lives as hired hands. All right, so that's it. We went about an hour and 15 minutes. That's going to do it for this video, and I thank you for watching the Brigham Young and Utah slavery video.